In Guinea-Bissau, a coup happened without the sound of a single gunshot. Instead, something stranger unfolded, a president who announced his own arrest before the military said a word. Then calmly drove to the airport and flew out of the country. A rival candidate who escaped an assassination attempt and is now hiding inside a foreign embassy. A military council that seized power but kept key allies of the so-called deposed leader in the new cabinet. And a regional bloc, ECOWAS, that arrived to negotiate but left with more questions than answers. This crisis does not look like a coup. It looks like something engineered, rehearsed, or quietly permitted. And now the biggest question hanging over West Africa is simple and explosive: will ECOWAS deploy troops into Guinea-Bissau if its mediation fails? Because on December 14th, the region's presidents will meet behind closed doors. They will read intelligence briefings, listen to accusations, and decide whether this is just another political meltdown, or the kind of instability ECOWAS claims it was created to stop. If this is the truth they do not want you to hear, leave a like.
ECOWAS, the chair of the authority, condemned the coup and calls for the immediate restoration of constitutional order, which includes allowing the electoral process to a logical conclusion.
Here are the facts. Guinea-Bissau held a presidential election on November 23. The results were never released. Both candidates claimed victory. One day before the official announcement, the military stepped in, suspended the process, and installed Major General Orta Aina as interim leader. President Umaro Sissoco Embalo declared himself arrested, yet somehow drove freely to the airport and left the country. His rival, Fernando Dias da Costa, said armed loyalists attacked his home. He fled to the Nigerian embassy and requested protection. Nigeria then asked ECOWAS to authorize ECOMIB forces already stationed in Bissau to secure the embassy. ECOWAS arrived, negotiated, failed, and scheduled a decisive meeting for December 14th. And that is where the real battle begins.
I simply wanted to inform you that once again, we are the target of a fabricated coup attempt. I am the winner of the elections. I have polling station reports confirming my victory. I won the elections. So how could I possibly orchestrate a coup? After all, who is behind this?
To understand what happened in Guinea-Bissau, you cannot start with the coup. You cannot start with the election. And you definitely cannot start with a president who claimed he was arrested, but somehow managed to escape the country without a single soldier blocking his path. You have to start much deeper, in the place where the real power of Guinea-Bissau has always lived, in the uneasy marriage between the military, the cocaine trade, and a political system built on favors instead of institutions. Because what looks like a sudden crisis from the outside has roots that run back decades. Guinea-Bissau is small, poor, and forgotten by most of the world. But in the underworld economy, it is a giant. For more than 15 years, it has been one of the main gateways for cocaine from Latin America into Europe. Planes land on abandoned runways. Boats slip in through unmonitored creeks. Cartels pay in cash, weapons, and influence. And every time a new political crisis erupts, it is not just a fight for power. It is a fight for who controls the route. That is why every president, every general, every party, no matter the slogans, has always had a shadow behind it. This shadow is the real reason Guinea-Bissau can collapse overnight without a shot being fired. Inside that shadow stands the military, a force that has overthrown governments, protected governments, or simply stood aside depending on which faction is paying, promising, or threatening them at the moment. They are not a unified institution. They are a constellation of loyalties, rivalries, and old war scars that never healed. President Embalo came into power promising to tame the generals. But he did not. He chose instead to build his own network, reward his own loyal officers, and sideline the men he did not trust. Over time, the military split into two centers of gravity, the faction tied to Embalo, protected by political appointments, and the older faction that resented him but waited for the right moment to strike. That moment arrived on November 23. Embalo expected a comfortable victory. He had spent months preparing the ground, influencing the Electoral Commission, placing allies in local administrations, and projecting an image of inevitability. But something shifted. Reports from polling stations suggested that Fernando Dias da Costa, the opposition candidate, was performing far better than expected. Dias da Costa drew support from the urban poor, The military, old guard, and the business groups tired of Embalo's centralization of power. For the first time, Embalo's defeat was possible, not guaranteed, but possible enough to trigger panic. And that panic moved quickly. According to people close to the electoral process, the results were going to be unfavorable to the president. Not catastrophic, but enough for a runoff he feared he could lose. And then something happened that turned political trouble into life-or-death threat. Armed groups loyal to Embalo reportedly surrounded Diaz da Costa's home. Shots were fired. Neighbors fled. The candidate escaped only because his security team knew a back route to the Nigerian embassy. When he arrived, terrified, he requested immediate protection. This is where the crisis opened like a fault line. Because protecting an opposition candidate is not just a diplomatic gesture, it is a political statement. Nigeria requested ECOWAS authorization for ECOMIB forces to secure the embassy. That alone signaled the level of danger. But something else happened that was even stranger. ECOMIB did nothing. The force that exists specifically to prevent coups, safeguard institutions, and stabilize crises simply stayed still. No deployment. No cordon. No emergency posture. It was like watching a fire brigade refuse to turn on the water. Why? Because ECOMIB is not neutral. It depends on funding, political agreements, and consent from national authorities. And in Bissau, everyone was waiting to see which way the wind would blow. The military, old guard realized that Embalo was suddenly vulnerable. The Electoral Commission stopped the results. The generals acted, not with violence, but with bureaucratic precision. They dissolved the government, appointed Major General Orta Aina, and froze the political process. It looked like an intervention, but it felt like a negotiated pause. And this is where the deeper truth sits. The coup was not about saving democracy. It was not about stopping chaos. It was about settling old scores inside the security apparatus. It was about deciding who controls the cocaine corridor. It was about preventing Embalo from using state power to crush his rivals after a disputed election. And it was also about protecting the faction that feared he would purge them if he won a second term. This is the moment when many people watching from outside miss the most important signal. Because while the world debates whether this was a coup or a counter-coup, people inside Guinea-Bissau know exactly what it was: a correction. A controlled burn. A way to stop one man from consolidating power without allowing the opposition to take full power either. In this sense, the military did not seize the country. They froze it. And if this sounds deliberate, it is because it was. If you believe this did not happen by accident but by design, tell me in the comments. When you look closely, every player acted with surgical timing. Embalo declared himself arrested to gain international sympathy, but no one stopped his convoy to the airport. The military announced a transitional government but included key loyalists of Embalo, ensuring he still has leverage from abroad. Diaz da Costa survived, but now lives inside a diplomatic compound, unable to campaign or speak freely. ECOWAS arrived, but instead of exerting pressure, they left with a meeting scheduled for December 14th, buying everyone time to decide how the story should end. And that is the core of the internal crisis. No one wants the truth to come out. Not the generals tied to the drug routes. Not the politicians who benefited from the chaos. Not ECOWAS, which does not want another embarrassment like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. And certainly not Embalo, who needs to portray himself as a victim rather than a leader who may have lost an election. Guinea-Bissau today is not living through a spontaneous breakdown. It is living through a negotiated stalemate between actors who fear one another more than they fear instability. And that is why the country can fall apart so quietly, without a single gunshot, yet shake the entire region.
I was looking for the appropriate word to describe. I couldn't get it. I described it as a ceremonial coup. It was a ceremony conducted by the head of state himself.
Power in Guinea-Bissau has always lived behind the curtain. The politicians are performers, but the real script comes from somewhere else. And in this moment, that script is being rewritten by a cast of actors whose motives overlap, clash, and occasionally collide in the dark. Start with President Umaro Sissoco Embalo, the man at the center of the storm. He has always been a paradox, a civilian president with a military posture. A reformist who built a loyal circle of officers, and a head of state who concentrated power while insisting he was decentralizing it. Embalo rose to prominence not because he had popular support, but because he mastered the art of alliances. He built bridges with foreign partners, especially with Senegal and certain business networks tied to Europe. Inside Guinea-Bissau, he cultivated a tight circle of military allies, rewarded them with promotions, and relied on them to counterbalance the older factions inside the armed forces. His presidency was not a government. It was a balancing act. But a balancing act only works as long as the performer does not slip. And in the weeks leading up to the election, Embalo slipped. He underestimated the military's old guard, overestimated his own control over the electoral process, and forgot that in Guinea-Bissau, political loyalty changes faster than the weather. When he realized the vote was not going in his favor, he made the fatal mistake of projecting weakness. And nothing attracts danger in Bissau faster than the scent of weakness. The man the military installed as transitional leader, Horta Intaena man, is not just a former army chief. He is a symbol. He represents the institutional memory of the armed forces, the men who fought the civil war, the officers who saw presidents rise and fall and never believed civilian leaders should wield unchecked authority. He is not charismatic. He is not loud. But he has something Embalo never had, the respect of the old units. When the troops loyal to the old guard saw him return, they did not question who was in charge. They saluted. The network behind Horta Intaena man is built not on personal loyalty, but on shared survival. These officers resented Embalo's attempts to sideline them. They feared he would purge them after the election. And they understood that the moment the Electoral Commission reported irregularities and ballots went missing, the political ground was shifting. They moved in not to seize power, but to prevent a purge they believed was coming. Their logic was simple: if Embalo wins, they lose everything. If they act first, they survive. But the most fascinating detail of this takeover is not the return of the old guard. It is the presence of Embalo's own loyalists in the new transitional government. 28 ministers were appointed. A significant portion of them are people who worked directly under the former president. This is not an oversight. This is an insurance policy. By keeping Embalo's people inside the system, the military ensures two things: stability during the transition and leverage in negotiations. The message is subtle but unmistakable. Embalo may be out, but he is not gone. His shadow still sits at the table. And that shadow shapes the calculation of ECOWAS. The regional bloc knows that if it pushes too hard, it risks being seen as defending a leader who may have manipulated an election and possibly lost it. But if ECOWAS does not push at all, it risks confirming what many in West Africa already believe, that the bloc cannot stop a coup, cannot protect democracy, and cannot control its own narrative. This is why the ECOWAS delegation arrived quickly but left quietly. They face a dilemma without a good solution. Within ECOWAS, the power struggle is just as intense as the one inside Guinea-Bissau. Nigeria, usually the anchor of the region, has domestic security challenges and a political leadership unwilling to open a new military front. Ghana, once a strong advocate of democracy, is dealing with economic pressure and limits on its ability to intervene. Senegal is the closest ally of Embalo, but it cannot act alone without appearing self-interested. And everyone remembers what happened in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. ECOWAS threatened action. The juntas called their bluff. The bloc lost credibility. This time, they want to avoid humiliation. But they also want to avoid committing to a military intervention that no member state actually supports. Because despite the rumors and the fears, the truth is that ECOWAS has no intention of sending troops to Guinea-Bissau. The legal framework allows it, but the political will is missing. The costs are too high. The allies are too divided. The ground is too unstable. And the presence of Embalo's loyalists in the transitional government creates enough ambiguity for ECOWAS to claim that the situation is resolvable without force. Meanwhile, there is a third network hiding behind the scenes: the economic elites and the trafficking interests. They benefit from disorder, from transitions, from the absence of a clear winner. For them, chaos is not a crisis. It is a market condition. As long as the state is fragmented and the security forces are divided, the cocaine route continues to operate. These groups do not care who runs the government. They care who controls the checkpoints. And right now, the checkpoints are controlled by men they understand. The final actor in this drama is the opposition candidate Fernando Dias da Costa. On paper, he is a threat to both Embalo and the military. But his position inside the Nigerian embassy turns him into a symbol rather than a player. He cannot move. He cannot rally supporters. He cannot address the nation. His survival depends on foreign diplomats. And that makes him a hostage of the narrative. The more he speaks, the more dangerous his position becomes. The more silent he remains, the easier it is for others to claim they speak on his behalf. Some observers say this crisis is about protecting democracy. Others say it is about stopping an illegitimate president. Others see a military power grab. The truth is simpler and darker. This crisis is about networks, not institutions. It is about men, not laws. It is about fear, not ideology. And it is about a regional bloc trying desperately to look strong while avoiding any move that would expose just how weak it has become. If you believe ECOWAS is acting to defend democracy, you are missing the game. If you believe the military acted to save the nation, you are missing the players. And if you believe this is just another African crisis, you are missing the pattern. The truth is that Guinea-Bissau is not collapsing. It is recalibrating. The networks are adjusting. The factions are repositioning. And everyone is waiting for December 14th. When ECOWAS must choose between saving face and admitting defeat. If this feels engineered, orchestrated, or quietly coordinated, it is because in Guinea-Bissau, nothing this big ever happens by chance. When a country like Guinea-Bissau falls into crisis, the world tends to look at it as an isolated incident, a small nation with small problems. But in West Africa, nothing happens in isolation. Every shock in one capital sends tremors through another. Every collapse opens an opportunity, not just for politicians, but for alliances, military blocs, and transnational interests that operate far beyond the borders of the country in question. The coup in Guinea-Bissau may appear local, but its implications stretch across the region like cracks in drying earth. Start with ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States. A bloc that once prided itself on being the most integrated region on the continent. 20 years ago, ECOWAS was the model, peacekeepers in Liberia, mediators in Sierra Leone. Stabilizers in Guinea, enforcers in Gambia. They intervened, negotiated, and occasionally coerced. They were the referees of the West African game. But that was before the rise of the sovereignist wave sweeping through the Sahel. In 2023, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger broke away, forming the Alliance of Sahel States. 3 countries, each led by military juntas, rejected ECOWAS sanctions, rejected its timelines, and rejected its legitimacy. The break was not just political. It was psychological. ECOWAS lost its aura of inevitability. The 3 juntas did not collapse. They survived, gained popular support, aligned with new security partners, and reshaped the regional balance. Every president in the region watched closely. If the juntas survived, maybe rebellion could too. If ECOWAS blinked once, maybe it would blink again. And now, with Guinea-Bissau in crisis, ECOWAS is staring into the same dilemma. If they intervene strongly, they risk being accused of defending an unpopular leader. If they stay silent, they confirm that their power is fading. Every move has a cost. Every hesitation has a consequence. Senegal, which shares deep political ties with Embalo, wants a firm response. They fear instability on their southern flank. They fear the return of traffickers and militants who once used the Casamance region as a corridor. But Senegal cannot lead a military intervention alone. It would look like an invasion. Nigeria, the traditional heavyweight of the region, is juggling internal insecurity from the northwest to the southeast. The government in Abuja does not have the appetite for another peacekeeping operation. Their priority is domestic, kidnappings, banditry, insurgency. Nigeria wants stability, but not at the price of deploying troops. Ghana, once ECOWAS's moral voice, is going through one of its toughest economic moments. They need stability to maintain investor confidence. They prefer diplomacy, not force. And then there is the invisible actor, the Alliance of Sahel States. They are watching ECOWAS closely. A strong intervention would be condemned as neo-colonial pressure. A weak response would validate their decision to leave the bloc. Either outcome strengthens their political narrative, the old order is collapsing. The sovereignist model is rising. Guinea-Bissau becomes, unintentionally, a test. Not of democracy. Not of military rule. But of ECOWAS's ability to remain relevant in a region where power has shifted from conference tables to military barracks. From diplomats to commanders, from institutions to networks. Beyond politics, the crisis exposes another dimension, the underworld economy that ties West Africa to Latin America and Europe. The cocaine route is not a rumor. It is an artery pumping billions through the region. Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, Senegal, Guinea, and even Gambia are part of this shadow map. Stability threatens this trade. Chaos protects it. A government in transition, a divided military, and a distracted ECOWAS are the perfect ingredients for traffickers to expand operations. This is why foreign powers are paying attention. Not just the usual players like France or Portugal, but intelligence agencies in Europe who monitor the flow of drugs into Lisbon, Madrid, and Paris. Guinea-Bissau may be small, but its instability is global. A seized shipment on a beach in Portugal can be traced back to a political decision made in Bissau. A spike in cocaine in Marseille can be tied to a temporary breakdown in border security in West Africa. But the most dangerous part of this crisis is not the trafficking. It is the psychological impact on the region. Sierra Leone is recovering from protests and attempted mutinies. Liberia is dealing with factionalism. Gambia is battling internal dissent. Senegal is entering a volatile election cycle. Nigeria is struggling with economic pressure and security challenges. The region does not have the resilience it once had. If Guinea-Bissau collapses, it sends a message: ECOWAS cannot protect its members. The model is broken. And in a region where military coups have become political options rather than political catastrophes, this message is corrosive. It encourages opportunists. It emboldens rivals. It tempts factions inside fragile governments. The crisis in Bissau might become the spark for trouble elsewhere. Which brings us to the most anticipated date, December 14th. The ECOWAS Summit. A room where presidents will be forced to choose a narrative. Will they declare the transition illegitimate? Will they demand the reinstatement of Embalo? Or will they call for calm? Avoid escalation and quietly move on. If you think these decisions are made in the interest of the people of Guinea-Bissau, tell me in the comments, because the truth is more complicated. Inside that room, 3 outcomes are possible. First, ECOWAS may announce targeted sanctions against the transitional leadership. This is the safest choice. It signals displeasure without committing to action. Second, the bloc may demand a timeline for new elections. This offers a path forward but leaves the military in control. Third, ECOWAS may threaten military intervention, but only to save face. Not to execute it. The members do not have the will or unity to send troops. What they will not do is the one thing the opposition wants: force the release of the original election results. That would expose too many actors, too many irregularities, too many truths no one wants to confront. Guinea-Bissau today is the mirror of West Africa, a collection of states that look stable from afar but are deeply fragile underneath. Institutions are thin. Networks dominate. And the regional body tasked with holding everything together is itself tearing at the seams. In the end, the crisis is not about Bissau. It is about Dakar, Abuja, Accra, Bamako, Ouagadougou, Niamey. The stability of an entire region now rests on the decisions of leaders who are themselves navigating storms. That is why this moment matters. Not because Guinea-Bissau is powerful, but because its weakness is contagious. Here is the part no one wants to say out loud. Maybe this was never a coup. Maybe it was an exit strategy disguised as chaos. Because when you put every piece together, the story stops looking like a sudden military takeover and starts looking like something else entirely: a staged disruption. A negotiated reset, an orchestrated pause designed to protect the man who was about to lose. Look at the timeline again. The election happens. Early reports suggest the vote is not going the way the incumbent hoped. Irregularities appear. Ballots and tally sheets disappear from the election commission. Armed men loyal to the president attack the home of an opposition supporter. The opposition candidate flees to the embassy of a foreign nation. And then, at the exact moment when the Electoral Commission is expected to release results, the military steps in. No shots. No resistance. No chaos. Just a quiet suspension of the process. And then comes the strangest detail of all: the president who claims he was arrested walks freely into a convoy, drives to the airport, and flies out of the country with no obstruction from the same soldiers who supposedly overthrew him. It is a scene that does not match the narrative. Coup victims do not leave in motorcades. They do not board planes. They do not reappear on international television describing their own downfall before the junta even speaks. If this were a real coup, the military would have purged the president's allies. Instead, they appointed many of them to the transitional government. If this were a real overthrow, the generals would have seized his assets, neutralized his loyalists, and dismantled his political machine. Instead, they left his network partially intact, as if preserving a bargaining chip for later. It looks less like a coup and more like a freeze. A controlled halt. A moment designed to stop the electoral clock before it revealed a defeat that could not be explained away. A defeat that would have stripped Embalo of his authority, his leverage, and possibly his immunity. The military had its reasons too. They feared a purge. They feared consolidation of power. They feared being sidelined in a second term. Stopping the process served their interests as well. Two sides, one crisis, both benefiting from the same interruption. That is why ECOWAS cannot decide how to react. If they call it a coup, they must sanction the leaders who are, in part, allies of the man they once supported. If they call it a political crisis, they must acknowledge that an election was derailed by actors inside the state itself. And if they threaten military intervention, they expose their own weakness. Because the truth is simple, no one in West Africa wants to send troops to restore a president who may have engineered the very chaos used to justify his exit. This is the twist beneath the headlines. The military did not remove Embalo. Embalo and the military removed the election. They took away the one thing that would have settled the question of legitimacy. And now, as the region waits for the ECOWAS summit on December 14, one unspoken truth hangs over everything: the crisis was not a rupture. It was a strategy. Guinea-Bissau now stands in a silence that feels heavier than war. No gunfire, no smoke, no columns of troops. Just a country suspended in midair, held between what was supposed to happen and what powerful men decided would happen instead. The ballots are gone. The president is gone. The truth is gone. And the people are left waiting for a future that someone else will choose for them. But crises like this never stay contained. They spill across borders. Across alliances, across the fragile psychology of an entire region. If ECOWAS cannot hold one small nation together, how will it hold West Africa together? If an election can be paused, erased, or rewritten, what does legitimacy mean anywhere in the region? And if leaders can script their own downfall, what does accountability look like? The answer will not come from Bissau alone. It will come from every capital watching this moment and wondering whether institutions still matter, or whether power now moves only through fear, force, and calculated silence. If you believe the people of West Africa deserve better than this, like, comment, and subscribe. Not for me, but for every voice that has never been heard.